Okay, so building on that discussion of sort of Jacksonian democracy, building on the discussion of the critical period in American history and how we have to sort through a number of things if we're going to survive as a nation. Now we kind of move into the point where we're edging ever closer to the road to the Civil War, right? The road to the Civil War. What we're going to see is that this imagined community is still growing, still developing, still becoming what it is we do become, but it's also in conflict. Seems like every other minute, right? There's some sort of conflict that seems to be happening, some challenges that seem to be happening. So you have kind of national movements, national growth, but we also still have that kind of regional conversation we talked about last time, that sectionalism, right, is already beginning to develop where the two regions are looking at each other as different. Right? Northerners and Southerners feel like they're different. Now, eventually, looking at themselves as different becomes enemies. Right? They go from being different to being enemies. And we want to see how that happens because I think that's an important sort of step. We talked a while back about the First Great Awakening, right? The First Great Awakening. So this term is supposed to say Second Great Awakening. At some point, that got deleted. Remember that First Great Awakening was a religious movement? But we really talked about it more in terms of its political significance, right? We talked about it more in terms of its social significance, how it's going to challenge religious people to try to get back closer to God and figure out what God wants them to do with their lives, right? And how that's going to change into a political movement because once you decide that God wants you to do something different with your life, that he wants you to change your society, no one can stop that. Right? Any president that gets in the way is an opponent, an obstacle. Any king that gets in the way is an opponent. So many historians trace the First Great Awakening to the Revolution. I decided that once these ideas of authority are challenged, they're going to be challenged on every level. Well, we have a Second Great Awakening in the early 1800s. Right? A Second Great Awakening will occur really beginning about 1800 or 1801. This Second Great Awakening occurs, and it's going to have some of the same outcomes and same significance. Yes, it is a religious movement, but I think it's much more significant that it's going to have both social and political implications. Right? It's going to change the way people look at the world. So what is it about? Well, the Second Great Awakening is going to involve many of the same themes as the first. Right? A return to American religion, right? This idea that people had fallen away from God and that God was upset about that. Right? That there are certain social problems in their society that who else is going to address them if they don't? Right? Think about this today, how ordinary people will do things like work with charities or contribute to charity, right? So you'll have a working class family that scrapes together $10 to contribute to the American Cancer Society. Why do they do that? Well, the government has trillions of dollars they could contribute to. What does your little $5 do? Well, altogether it does do something, and I think it makes you part of a movement. It makes you part of an imagined community. I think everybody pulling in the same direction feels a certain kind of way. And so in the 19th century, you're going to see similar trends, similar movements, similar strategies, and those are significant. Right? Those are significant. I saw over the weekend that the V Foundation through ESPN, right, they raise money for cancer every year, and they just raised $100 million this year in that movement. So that this is amazing if you think about that individuals outside of government, outside of those that are rich and famous even, can impact their society. So what we're going to see is that this religious movement is going to lead to social change. This religious movement will lead to a number of social reforms. So we'll just look at a couple of examples of some of these key social reforms. How ordinary people are going to decide that something is wrong with their society and that they have the power to change it. Right? I think Americans still have that feeling quite often. So what are some of these social reforms? Well, we'll see. The movement begins, the Second Great Awakening begins in places that we would expect it to begin. New England, right? This kind of religious society. It's going to spread throughout the eastern United States and throughout the entire country. Right? This revivalism, especially in the North, is going to call people to say, you know what? We can't just go to church and learn what we should do. We have to go out into society and actually do it. We have to actually go out and do it. So as new congregations are growing or developed, right, or reinvigorated, a number of benevolent societies will spring up. Benevolent society is basically a group of people that come together to help, to do something. So, for example, some religious leaders will address specific issues that they saw as the most pressing issues. So, for example, some ministers say we have to stop dueling. Right? What is a duel? Well, we talked about dueling a bit with Andrew Jackson last time. Remember, someone insults his wife, and so they say, okay, look, tomorrow at noon, it's pistols at 30 paces, right? So then they do the whole thing and have the guns and walk the paces and shoot. Often people die. Right? Often people die in this kind of honor performance. And so some ministers are like, this is wrong. This is a social problem. Right? So some ministers will try to stop dueling in society. They saw that as the major problem in their society. Some will address gambling. Right? The issue of gambling. We still deal with issues of gambling and gambling problems, right? You see billboards every now and then. If you have a gambling problem, call this number. Why? Because it's seen as a social problem, not just for the individual gambler, but say a husband gets his check and bets it all on the Rams to win the Super Bowl. Right? And then he has no check. How does that impact the family? We know that it does. So some will look at gambling as a social problem to be addressed. Some would address prostitution in the early 1800s. Right? Some talk about prostitution as the oldest profession. Well, it's definitely a 19th century profession because it's something that they felt they had to change in order to make this nation as good as it could be. But for many, the fight against drunkenness, right? The fight against drunkenness will achieve the greatest notoriety. Right? This idea of drunkenness, and this is going to lead to a temperance movement. Temperance movement means the movement to cut down on drinking. Since the American Revolution, whiskey was the most popular beverage in the country. Whiskey was the most popular beverage in the country. Another textbook I used to use said, quote, whiskey was cheaper than milk or beer, and it was safer than water, which was often contaminated. So folks might be drinking whiskey for a lot of reasons. In part, it's cheaper. In part, you might drink milk or water and get sick. Right? But you can see why this might be problematic to wake up and have a little Jack Daniels. I have a couple of friends that have written books on this subject, and they talk about the 19th century as being, we are an alcoholic republic, according to the title of one book. Some of these scholars talk about factories, where on the factory floor there's a keg of beer. Sounds like a great job, right? Like, man, I don't even need benefits. You got a keg? But imagine how problematic it might be to be working in the steel mill, and there's a keg right there. Everybody go and filling up. After a couple, your work is not so precise. Right? You might mess around and lose an arm, right? Because you're a little too tipsy. But why would an employer do this? Well, employers came to recognize that many of their workers were so poor that they weren't getting the proper caloric intake. They would come to work and they couldn't do their jobs because they were so hungry they didn't have enough calories. What's a good way to sort of pump calories into people? Beer. So it actually played into their interest, but you can also see why that might be problematic. And why it might have some social issues. Right? Impact on the liver, impact on families. So this temperance movement is going to be a major movement that folks will many of them feel it's the most pressing issue. Now what's interesting about this is different individuals and different groups decide for themselves what they think the major problem is. If I asked 40 people in this room what the major social problem is, you might have 40 different answers today. Actually, we may do some of those exercises coming up and kind of see what you think the most pressing problem for the United States is right now. These folks are doing the same thing. They're looking around at their society and they're deciding that, you know what, it's drunkenness, it's dueling, it's gambling, it's prostitution, it's any number of things. So this temperance movement in particular is going to be a major sort of touchstone for people. The temperance movement is going to be very successful at attracting Americans, ultimately millions of Americans, mostly women, to the anti-drinking cause. Why do you think women in particular might be interested in joining the temperance movement? Why do you think this might become kind of a women's movement overall? Some say 80% of the movement might be women. Why do you think that might be the case? Physical abuse, right? Think about what drunkenness tends to cause. There are all kinds of statistics about how the Super Bowl day is one of the most abusive days in terms of domestic violence, right? Often that has to do with alcohol as well, not just your team losing, but the fact that your team is losing and you're drunk and you act crazy, right? So some women are going to look at this as a particular way to intervene in their society, to make their lives better, to make their children's lives better, to make families better, and therefore the entire nation. Now, what's interesting is these women are being political by doing this. Right? They're being political actors at a moment before women can vote. We tend not to think of women as political because they can't vote till the 20th century, right? But these women are being very political. They're forming movements. Some of these movements will become incredibly powerful and have the ear of politicians. So suddenly, a politician comes to New York City, he's got to go find the temperance leader. Right? He's got to go find a Frances Willard, who becomes one of the most powerful women of the 19th century. So it's really interesting to think about how this religious movement leads to politics, even in non-traditional ways, or for people that we don't think of as traditionally political. So yeah, it's a perfect answer. Now, this temperance movement is going to be successful at drawing people, especially women. The movement will become divided between those that advocated total abstinence from drinking, like so don't drink anything at all, and those that advocated that we need to at least cut it down a little bit. So there are some limits there. Some sought to limit only hard liquor, and that beer might be okay, but hard liquor might be the devil's drink and that sort of thing. By the 1830s, alcohol consumption in the U.S. had been significantly reduced. Right? It had been significantly reduced. Another outgrowth of the Second Great Awakening was the abolitionist movement. We haven't fully talked about antebellum slavery yet because we're not quite to the antebellum period, which means the period before the Civil War. But we've already touched on how significant politically that issue of slavery is. Abolition develops in this period and will grow. In fact, you're going to get a radical abolitionist movement developing in the 1820s and 1830s. What does that mean? Well, abolitionists, those that want to abolish slavery, want to get rid of it, are becoming more and more radical, more and more vocal in this period. They're louder, they are much more vocal, and much more radical. But this starts from somewhere. We talked about how a kind of anti-slavery movement really is beginning with the Revolution. A lot of people questioning whether we can really be a free nation and hold slaves. But by the 1820s, 1830s, there are a lot of folks calling for immediate abolition, right, that slavery should end that day. They're calling for uncompensated abolition. Right, someone like a William Lloyd Garrison is going to argue that slaveholders should lose all of their slaves and not be paid, not be compensated. Some are like, well, wait a second, what about property rights? Garrison says there are no property rights in people. This is a radical position, because think about someone that's a millionaire one day. You go up to them and tell them, hey, you're broke. What do you mean? Your slaves are free. And think about what their reaction might be when they start to feel like they're losing something. Some will say this is pushing us closer to civil war. Right, so many evangelical leaders in the North would push moral objections to slavery. Right, many ministers are like, man, how can you read this Bible and think that it justifies slavery? Whereas, as we know, some other ministers will read certain sections of the Bible, especially that passage that says, slaves obey your masters, and say, well, it's okay. But a lot will start to change their mind. Right, a lot of them will start to feel like, you know what, we're going to hell. And when a religious person feels like they're going to hell, they often will change certain behaviors. So these evangelical leaders, especially in the North, right, a lot of this becomes a northern movement, which again is significant for our purposes. Now, even among abolitionists, very few of them believed in equal rights. Even among abolitionists, you had a lot of racism. How does that make sense? How is someone pushing for an end to slavery but a racist? Did any of you answer that for me? How could you have abolitionists that are still racist, do you think? Because you did. How is that possible? Why might someone be an abolitionist if they weren't in favor of equal rights?
Does that have to do with religion? Does that have to do with religion?
Could be. That could be one reason. You just feel like it's a sin, so you don't want to sin, so you should get rid of slavery. That could be one possibility for some. Okay, so they may have these sort of differences based on skin color, but still feel like people are people and you can't enslave people generally, so that kind of theoretical. Okay. Why else? Other reasons? You think people might be in favor of abolition, right? In favor of getting rid of slavery, but not be in favor of sort of equal rights, integration, marrying across the color line, or any number of things. Some businessmen, some northern factory owners are like, no, we got to get rid of slavery. People are like, why? What does that have to do with you in Boston? You don't have any slaves. Now, well, how do I compete? As a factory owner with 1,000 employees, how in the world do I compete by paying my employees? How do I compete with labor that's not paid? Say I have a textile mill in Massachusetts and there's a textile mill in Alabama where they don't have to pay people because they're slaves. You can't compete. So for some people, economics, simple dollars and cents. So they're like, nah, we got to get rid of the slavery thing. Or definitely don't let it expand into new states. But some of those same folks will argue that once they are freed, they got to go someplace else. They can't stay here. So we'll see both of those ideas spring up. Both of those ideas. Most of the early abolitionists advocated gradual emancipation. So basically, you'll free people over a long period of time. New York and some other states actually do gradual emancipation. So when they abolished, they were like, okay, well, people will be slaves till 25 years old, and then they'll be free. So it actually could happen over decades. Right? That's how it happens in many places in the North. Whereas others, like a William Lloyd Garrison, is like, that's ridiculous. Right? That's ridiculous. So most of the early abolitionists are more gradualist, but we're going to get a louder and more vocal, radical abolitionist movement. Most of these early abolitionists proposed sending freed slaves back to Africa to calm the fears of white Americans. They're like, okay, look, if we're going to free these 4 million slaves, by the time the Civil War comes, they got to go someplace else. Even Lincoln didn't necessarily believe that the nation could be a multiracial nation. Right? Even some fairly progressive folks. So, for example, in 1821, an organization called the ACS, I didn't put it up there, the ACS, or the American Colonization Society, was formed. ACS. Not supposed to say American. What is the American Colonization Society? Well, the American Colonization Society was a collection of some pretty powerful individuals, including several presidents, right, who will develop the idea of emigration with an E, or colonization. The idea was if you freed slaves, you had to send these free blacks someplace else. Where are you going to send them? Well, why not back to Africa? Why not back to Africa? Never mind the fact that many of the slaves by this point had been 6th or 7th or 8th or 9th or 10th generation Americans that weren't born in Africa. This idea was send them back to Africa to kind of remove the problem. Think about how this solution kind of parallels the solution for the Indian problem. Right? Indians are in the way, let's move them someplace else, reservations or whatever. So now these free blacks are in the way, let's move them elsewhere. For many, that is going to be a solution, even among abolitionists. So in 1821, the ACS would establish the colony of Liberia in West Africa. The nation of Liberia today is set up around this idea. Liberia, the capital of Liberia, is a city called Monrovia. Monrovia is named after President James Monroe, who was president of the U.S. at the time. So it's named after him. Several thousand African Americans would be settled there, but most African Americans rejected the idea of colonization. Most of them decide that they're American and don't want to go anywhere. They don't know Africa. They hadn't been there for 6, 7, 8 generations, and many of them feel like they put in free labor here, so why should they go anyplace else? But think about this idea. Think about this in terms of imagined community. Just going back to where you're from. Well, I don't really know that place. Why am I not a part of this imagined community? So it really is a question for several different groups. By the early 1830s, the abolitionist movement is also split between those that continue to call for gradual emancipation and the removal of blacks to Africa or elsewhere, and those that want immediate, unconditional abolition. One of the leaders of the so-called radicals is going to be a guy named William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison is a really important figure. William Lloyd Garrison was a white abolitionist who was incredibly radical for the time. This is why we got to get away from kind of simplistic understandings of race that all white people are bad and all black people are good. That's not going to work for our purposes. Someone like a William Lloyd Garrison is going to complicate that from the beginning. Garrison is a white guy from Boston. He starts publishing his newspaper, The Liberator, in 1831. And he is incredibly radical. He demands immediate, uncompensated abolition. Don't pay slaveholders. Garrison is like, look, if you're selling coke and the DEA kicks in your door and takes the coke, they are not going to write you a check for your property because it's illegal property, right? But then the slaveholders are like, well, slavery is not illegal, so it's not necessarily the same thing. But Garrison said it's immoral, so you shouldn't be compensated for it. So he begins publishing his newspaper. Garrison does things like publicly burn copies of the Constitution. He gets a copy of the Constitution, lights it on fire in protest. Think about issues like burning the flag, right, in protest. Why does he do this? He felt that the Constitution, since it justified slavery, was, as he said, a pact made with the devil. We should throw it out and start over. So many of these abolitionists are going to seem very radical for the time, right? There will be white and black abolitionists that will be pushing for the abolition of slavery. Garrison, though, is a really important one. There are other white abolitionists, too, like Elijah Lovejoy is a guy from Illinois who gets killed. They burned down his printing press 5 different times because he's publishing all these anti-slavery texts. And then when he tries to defend his press, they kill him over this. And this is a white guy. So you can imagine what would happen to black abolitionists and black slaves who resisted and protested, yet they still will. So someone like Garrison is significant, right? A few years later, Garrison will form an organization called the American Anti-Slavery Society. Garrison's movement was more attractive to already free blacks. Right? They liked what he was talking about. Many of them would become participants in it, including maybe the most prominent black abolitionist named Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, former slave that runs away and publishes his autobiography and spends the rest of his life fighting against slavery and racism. Women are also active in the abolitionist movement, right? They're active in various anti-slavery movements as well. And this is going to be significant in terms of U.S. history because many of them, again, are going to be politicized by their activity in an abolitionist movement. Women will seek leadership positions. They'll seek opportunities to speak publicly about how bad slavery is, how wrong it is, how bad it is for the nation, and how much of a sin it is. In Garrison's organization, they were given the opportunity, they were given a platform to speak. They were even allowed leadership positions. Other abolitionist movements did not allow women leadership positions. And actually, there's going to be a split in the movement because Garrison felt like women should have an equal role. And most other men, even if they were fighting against slavery, did not think that gender equality was a possibility. Now think about these women whose names we know, like a Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, right? Think about a Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton standing up to make a speech, and they're like, man, slavery's wrong, slaves can't vote, and slaves can't own property, and then you can imagine Susan B. Anthony like, wait a second, I can't vote, I can't own property. Right, so on one level, women's participation in abolition is going to lead directly to a women's suffrage movement. So some of these women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony will use their experience in abolition and start pushing for women's suffrage as well. Remember, suffrage, the right to vote. In 1848, supporters of equality and women's suffrage would meet in Seneca Falls, New York. Many historians consider this the birth of the feminist movement. Many of those women are veterans of abolition for at least a decade by that point. They would produce a document called the Declaration of Sentiments. Right? The Declaration of Sentiments was a document written along the same lines as the Declaration of Independence, but it highlights women's independence because they felt like all men are created equal, left out half the population. So think about the connections here and how all of this is unleashed perhaps by a second Great Awakening. There are going to be a number of other institutional reforms as well that come out of this, right? A number of other institutional reforms, social reforms of various types that people would find themselves interested in and supporting. Some of them might include dealing with mental illness in a way that's more humane. Dealing with mental illness in a way that's more humane. So there would be the development of asylums, for the mentally ill. Back in the day, there were no asylums. If you were mentally ill, you probably were turned out of doors, as they said, and you found yourself homeless. If you didn't have family to take care of you, you just kind of, whatever happened, happened. Right? You were in the public. Some people decide that that's not a good way to deal with people and that it's bad for the society, and so they will start to create asylums. Prisons will be reformed beginning in this period. We start to rethink punishment, and prisons in particular, as not only places of punishment, but also places of rehabilitation. So you see some of the modern prisons being born in this era, especially around the 1830s. This is also really around the time we get most modern police forces. We start to really rethink what a safe society should be and how it should function. Didn't really have professional police forces before. So the asylum movement, the prison movement, poorhouses for debtors, all considered what some considered to be more humane approaches. Remember back in the Shays' Rebellion, they had debtors' prisons. Right? Now they're going to switch to poorhouses, which are not great themselves. Right? It's this idea that you're going to teach people how to work so that they're not poor. But it's better than a debtor's prison. Right? Say you can't pay your credit cards, knock on wood. You can't pay your credit cards and they lock you up today. And they're like, okay, you can't get out till you pay your credit cards, but I can't go to work if I'm in prison. How do I pay them and get out? Figure it out. Think about how it's not necessarily a recipe for success. So some are going to start to at least rethink these things. Of course, what some consider the greatest or most powerful institutional reform, kind of alongside with abolition probably, is education. Educational reform will kick into gear, and many people will start to rethink education, especially the public school. In 1837, Horace Mann is a guy up in Massachusetts, I believe. He's going to persuade the Massachusetts legislature in 1837 to provide public support for primary schools. So like elementary schools, his argument is that government should support elementary schools because it educates young children who should be in school rather than working, and that's good for the society, right? To have an educated citizenry is good for the society. These primary schools would be supported by local taxes on property, which is still a major source of revenue for schools today. Somebody got waves going? Horace Mann and other reformers believed education should be used as a means to teach discipline as well. Some would argue to teach patriotism. What's one of the first things you learn in school? Pledge of Allegiance. So this notion that you could sort of teach patriotism from our youngest years and have it attached to education is an idea that kind of slowly develops. Whereas many colonial New Englanders saw education as a means of bringing people closer to God, others are going to say that this is going to be a means to make better citizens, right? to sort of make good middle-class values even, and that education could serve all of those roles. And Horace Mann's Common School movement would spread throughout New England and through the Middle Atlantic states, although it's going to take hold much more slowly in the South. We've sort of talked about how there's been some regional differences historically there and around education and such, and that would kind of continue throughout this period. In fact, many public high schools, the first public high schools really aren't built in the South until after the Civil War. So there's going to be, a bit of a lag historically there. In some ways still is. The South is going to suffer tremendously after the Civil War, as we will see. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about Texas to kind of conclude this part of it, right? Texas fits this notion yesterday, what we were talking about with the Manifest Destiny. The battle around Texas will also give us the birth of that term, Manifest Destiny itself, in 1845. So it's kind of an important, although quick discussion that we can have. Think again about this idea of the West, right? The West as an idea. In many ways, the West has been kind of synonymous with freedom for us, right? This idea of open land, this idea of opportunity, this idea that, okay, look, the East is all filled up now. All the eldest sons that expected to inherit land. How can you inherit land if there's no land left? So many of them go west, young man, right? Go west. So a lot of this is connected with notions of manhood as well, but also family, especially if you consider yourself sort of a provider, right? how are you going to provide without land? So the West has always been this, I think, really significant idea and reality for us. So think about how all this is connected to notions of reform and expansion. After the Louisiana Purchase, right, 1803, the U.S. will continue to look for additional lands to settle in the West. The West is going to be kind of like a reservoir, right, a way of releasing some of the maybe angst of the East and going west without causing too many problems. Some argue that maybe we don't have class warfare on the streets of, say, New York City, because the truly desperate can leave New York City and head out for California to try to strike it rich. So the West has always been, I think, a very important idea and reality for us. So after Louisiana Purchase, the U.S. will continue to look for land to settle. Most of Florida and southwestern Louisiana will be acquired from Spain in 1819. But it really is the West that kind of holds the greatest attraction for American settlers. During the 1820s, Americans will begin to move to Texas. Texas was a part of Mexico. But Americans begin to move there. Now, I want you to think about this using our concept of imagined community. Let's say this is the border, right? This is the border with Texas, so this is Mexico. You have these Americans over here that decide they're going to move to another country. They're going to move to another country. Why? Why would Americans do that? I thought only people came to America for opportunity. These Americans are going to be going the other direction. Right? So we see that this is kind of a universal desire for many people, and it begins in earnest in the 1820s. So they start moving to Texas, which is then part of a newly independent Mexico. Now, Mexico actually wants settlers to come and increase the population of Texas. And the Mexican government, in fact, would offer large tracts of land. Large tracts of land, fertile, inexpensive land to these farmers. Now, some of the same motivations we talked about as being the reasons why people come to the colonies, right? Land. If you're a farmer, if you don't have land, you're in trouble. If you do have land, you have a chance. So Mexico is offering large tracts of land to whites that were willing to move there. However, disagreements will start to spring up fairly early between the Mexican government and some of these white settlers in Texas. So why do I say use imagined community? Because literally folks are leaving the U.S. and going into another country. Yet, don't they still think of themselves as Americans? Well, yeah. They think of themselves as Americans living across the border. Now we see why this might start to cause some issues. Why? Why are there problems? Well, for one thing, Mexico had outlawed slavery. So what happens if a slaveholder in Alabama decides he's going to move to Texas and take advantage of this free and available land? He's going to bring his slaves with him, right? So how do you bring your slaves with you to a nation that does not have slavery? This is going to cause some issues. Even though the settlers in Texas were technically allowed to keep their slaves as lifelong indentured servants, most settlers who own slaves are reluctant to give up their full ownership rights. Right? Most of them are like, no. Remember, think about how important property rights are to this generation of Americans. Right? We fought a revolution around some of these ideas. So this is going to be a sticking point. So that's one issue, one problem that's already emerging is the issue of slavery. So that's number one. Number two, Mexico was a Catholic country. And required settlers there to convert to Catholicism. Now, are Protestant Americans going to be willing to convert to Catholicism? They do so when the Mexican government officials are in front of them, but they really converted in name only. They're like, yeah, I'm Catholic. Where's the land? Right, that's pretty much what it was. So most Americans were Protestant and converted in name only. So that's problem number two, religion. Number three, Mexico insisted that settlers in Texas pay duties or taxes. Pay duties or taxes on goods imported from the United States. Mexico's like, look, you're in another country now. If you're importing goods, you got to pay taxes. Now, I think if you're an American, you moved across the border, let's say you moved 10 miles across the border, right? You're setting up your new farm and all that, and you're trading with your friends and cousins 10 miles away back in the United States. Are you going to want to pay taxes on the stuff you get from your cousin? Think about how important this issue of taxation is for Americans. We fought a revolution around it. So we got three issues here that are going to have to be resolved that are already kind of sticking points in terms of early Texas. But think about how notions of imagined communities are Americans living in Mexico, but they don't necessarily consider themselves Mexican. Most settlers will resist paying these taxes and will continue to smuggle in American-made goods. By 1835, tensions between white settlers in Texas and the Mexican government had reached a boiling point. In 1836, settlers voted to declare independence from Mexico. Imagine community, nationalism. Right, they declare independence from Mexico, naming Sam Houston as their president. Think Houston, Texas. After less than 2 months of fighting, forces the Mexican General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna to sign a treaty recognizing Texas as an independent republic. So at this point, Texas is its own nation. It's its own independent republic. You heard about the Lone Star Republic. It's not a part of Mexico, but it's also not a part of the U.S. It's its kind of own animal. This lasts for about 9 years. So Texas is its own little country, essentially, for about a decade. They want to be annexed by the U.S. as part of this manifest destiny, but that does not happen right away. Now, again, these Texans do not want to really remain independent. In fact, they had reached out to Andrew Jackson in the 1820s to try to get him to annex them. But there are some issues with annexing Texas. Think about what's happening in the U.S. Think about this delicate balance between slave and free states that we laid out last time. Jackson and others are like, man, I don't know about this. There might be some issues to annexing Texas. So the new Texas government sent representatives to meet Jackson, but Jackson and others are reluctant to make Texas a part of the U.S., partly because they want to avoid full-scale war with Mexico, which may result. But in addition, there are other reasons. You start to hear various arguments about why we should not annex Texas. Number one, it's going to come in as a huge slave state. So many abolitionists in the North are like, nah, we don't want any more slave states. Remember the whole Missouri Compromise issue? Got to balance it out, and the delicate balance. Many of these abolitionists and Northerners don't want a huge new state coming in that allows slavery, which will tip the delicate balance. Some will argue against annexing Texas because there are too many Mexicans living there. They didn't feel like they could be assimilated. They didn't feel like they could be American. Racially, religiously, they're different. Right? So you will hear some racist arguments. You'll hear some religious arguments, political arguments as well. Jackson's vice president, Martin Van Buren, will become president in 1837. But he himself is kind of too busy with the panic that killing the Bank of the U.S. caused to kind of deal with this issue. Remember, Andrew Jackson that killed the bank, well, his successors have to kind of deal with that issue. So Texas kind of does its own thing for a number of years, nearly a decade. In addition to Texas's demands, other Western lands are going to come into the news. During the early 1840s, several thousand Americans had migrated to the northwest coast along the Oregon and California trails. So we saw some of that in the video yesterday, right? These settlers are moving west. They're getting to the west before this is the United States. Right? Those settlers are not waiting for the government to annex a territory, then move there. They're moving there and then hoping that they get annexed after the fact. Right? Again, they still think of themselves usually as Americans, but they're hoping that their government kind of catches up with them. Now, these folks that leave know that they're going into British territory if they go into Oregon, or Mexican territory if they go into California, let's say. But they hope that the U.S. will eventually catch up. The only migrant group that did not actively seek U.S. annexation were the Mormons. The Mormons are a religious group that are going to be migrating west as well. They had settled in Salt Lake City, Utah by 1846 after having faced persecution along the way in places like Illinois and Missouri. Right? Several of their leaders will be killed. In fact, folks don't like the Mormons so much. They felt like their religion was too different. Some of their cultural practices like polygamy, some of their cooperative farming seemed un-American to some, and so they had a rough time of it until they eventually settled further out west. Now, they just kind of set up their own imagined community. They're not so concerned about the U.S. annexing them. But everybody else kind of comes out west and then hopes, essentially, that the U.S. will catch up. During the 1840s, calls for the annexation of Texas and the acquisition of additional territory from Mexico, like California and Utah, become more and more vocal. So it seemed like we forgot about Texas for a minute, but then Texas is back in the news by the 1840s. Many expansionists will also seek American control over the Oregon country from the British. Some argue that we should fight a third war with England to take the Oregon territory if necessary. This is going to become an issue as we lead to the election of 1844. Right, there's a presidential election in 1844, and expansion in the West plays a major role in it. So in the election of 1844, a guy named James K. Polk, P-O-L-K, ran for president as a strong supporter of expansion. He runs as a strong supporter of expansion. He and others will subscribe to the idea of manifest destiny. Manifest destiny. We talked a bit about this yesterday, but again, more of a definition. Manifest destiny is the doctrine that it was America's God-given right, that it was our God-given right to extend our boundaries to the Pacific Ocean, or maybe even beyond that. Remember, this is a dramatic departure. Washington said, look, be concerned with affairs here. Some are now starting to argue that we should go beyond the Pacific even, and that will be the only thing that makes the nation great and makes the nation grow. So it's our God-given right. Some will say it's our responsibility to spread these American institutions, not just our right, but our responsibility. It's almost like if you have a gift, say you have water and you're in the desert, and you see people dying from dehydration. It's almost selfish of you not to share that gift. Right? Some will say that American democracy and capitalism is such a gift, and that we should share it. Others will say, look, if they don't ask you to share it, don't force it on them. So there's still some contradictions or complications or debates about American foreign policy even to this day. So manifest destiny, there are three main arguments that kind of underpin manifest destiny. Right? Three main arguments underpin manifest destiny. First of all, the term is coined by a newspaper editor from New York by the name of John O'Sullivan. John O'Sullivan. Yeah, John O'Sullivan coins the term in 1845, in fact. The first argument is that God was on the side of American expansion. God is on our side. We've kind of talked about this in the form of American exceptionalism before. God is on the side of American expansion. Secondly, American expansion means the spread of democratic institutions. Therefore, it's a good thing. American expansion means the spread of democratic institutions. Therefore, it's a good thing. Third, people argue that manifest destiny was good because our population growth made it necessary. We needed more territory, we needed more land to spread. This will give us economic opportunities. So really, it's number one, God is on our side, sort of religious ideas. Number two, politics, right? We can spread democratic institutions. And number three, economics, right? We can only grow economically if we have more land in which to grow. Well, James K. Polk wins, and his first order of business as president will be settling the dispute with Great Britain over the Oregon country. We are able to deal with that without going to war again with Oregon. A treaty signed in 1846 will establish the present-day boundary between the U.S. and Canada. When we look at the map, that line that's straight across is set in 1846. We signed a treaty with Great Britain to get that done. And this paves the way for a kind of full annexation of Oregon. Now, this helps calm the fear of many Northerners because Oregon's a northern state. Right? So many of them are like, you know what, Texas is probably going to come in eventually. At least you now have a northern state to balance it out. So Oregon will not have slavery, and the idea is that the likely acquisition of Texas, which will have slavery, can kind of be balanced out. So now with the dispute with Great Britain settled, Polk can turn his full attention to Mexico. He can turn his full attention to Mexico and Texas specifically. After Congress formally voted to annex Texas in 1845, the nation will prepare for war. Right? We kind of know war is going to happen over this issue. The Mexican-American War will begin earnestly in 1846 and last a little over 2 years. It goes very well for the Americans. They invade all the way to Mexico City, in fact, and force a surrender. Mexican surrender comes in February 1848, and they would sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, which goes very well for the U.S. side. In this treaty, Mexico would cede or give to the United States most of its Southwest and Pacific territories. Including what is now California, Nevada, Utah, and most of New Mexico and Arizona. Little pieces that we didn't get, but most of New Mexico and Arizona. So again, think of this in terms of that notion of American exceptionalism, this notion that the U.S. is chosen, that God's on our side, we keep having these miracles, we keep having victories. Right? This is seen as another one for many. We win. We get this massive growth of the nation in 1848. In that same year that we get California, gold is discovered in California. Again, think about this in terms of if you're a religious person, right? You just get, it's like, well, I'm going to say finding a wallet because that belongs to somebody else. Well, kind of the same thing, right? And then you find a lottery ticket in it. That's winning. That's essentially what happens. Gold is discovered in California in 1848 at Sutter's Mill, which is going to fuel more and more people migrating here as well. The war with Mexico will nearly complete U.S. expansion on the North American continent. There are a couple of other aspects that contribute to our expansion. The Gadsden Purchase, right? The Gadsden Purchase of 1853 completed the acquisition of the southern tip of New Mexico and Arizona. Right? So we didn't get the little tip, but we buy that. Alaska will be purchased from Russia after the Civil War, 1867. So many people consider that a part of our expansion as well. With territorial expansion nearly complete, the controversy over the spread of slavery is going to speed up because now there's all this new territory. Is it going to be slave? Is it going to be free? That question is going to constantly be raised, as we will see, and it's going to lead us to civil war. Last but not least, in addition to growing West, we also have a growing population. Immigration is a major issue. Obviously, our perspective in the West is a little more complicated in that the border is going to move around a bunch of folks that were already here that suddenly will now be in the U.S. instead of being in Mexico. So the West has always been a different animal. But even in the East, immigrants are flooding in this period. Immigrants from Ireland flood in the 1840s. In a 10-year period between 1845 and 1855, 1.5 million Irish come to the U.S., specifically after the potato famine, the potato blight. Folks are starving. They come in this period. Large numbers of Germans also come to the U.S. during this time, as well as smaller populations from places like Switzerland, Norway, Sweden, the Netherlands. This large influx of Irish folks, most of whom were poor and Catholic, fueled anti-immigrant feelings, anti-immigrant sentiment, which we often refer to as nativism. Right? It gives rise to so-called nativist movements. Nativism, by definition, is simply a prejudice against people not born in one's own country. Prejudice against foreigners, essentially. And with the acquisition of California, anti-immigrant sentiment will also focus on the Chinese. More than 90% of Chinese come to California as laborers in this period, and they're overwhelmingly male, which also brought some gender anxiety among many. So this is a complicated question depending on the region, but I think you're seeing some commonalities in this period. All of this growth is ultimately going to cause us to look inward, and that looking inward will kind of ultimately be problematic, right? It's going to force us to deal with some difficult questions. How we deal with those questions is now up for debate, and part of how we're going to end up dealing with those questions is through war.